always great. We are finishing up the 5th chapter of Galatians, if you want to be turning there. Oh. We got to the 22nd verse last Lord's Day as we were going through class. And in this chapter, we have Paul talking about a contrast between those who live after the Spirit and those who live after the flesh. And he's just given in these verses before verse 22 a whole long list of the works of the flesh, those things that are diabolical. They're the product of following Satan, and then he's going to contrast that with the person who's living a life not for Satan but for Christ. And he talks about the fruit of the Spirit. Do you think it's significant that he uses the singular for fruit and not plural? Have you ever thought about that? He's going to talk about the fruit of the Spirit, and he's going to list a whole bunch of different things. Why would he do that?
Kind of all one thing.
Right. It's not a matter, we don't pick and choose, do we? We're not going to say, well, I'm going to magnify and I'm going to just do this. I'm going to have that fruit of the Spirit and let somebody else have the other. No, it's an expectation that we're going to carry all of these personal traits. And so it's the fruit of the Spirit. When we live by the Spirit, this is what's going to be produced in our life. And so he goes through this list. And of course, he lists love first. And what's that?
Who receives the fruit of the Spirit. Am I correct on that?
You're going to have to talk louder, Mr. Wendell. I can't hear you. No, I just need a better pair of ears, but I can't get them.
God is one that directs or gives the fruit of the Spirit to whomever He wants.
Right. We've got to be acceptable to being receptive of those, don't we? Right.
To exhibit those things that he's talking about.
Right. Um, does that remind you of maybe something else Paul wrote concerning, for instance, love? Why do you think he listed it first? You know, in 1 Corinthians 13, he goes through these things that we can do by way of trying to follow Christ. But if the motivation is not right, does it do us any good? So love has got to be the motivation. And so that's the reason he listed it first as this fruit of the Spirit. Exactly.
Misunderstood what y'all were saying about God gives fruit of the Spirit to those He chooses. I would think God has all of those are open to any man, but you individually have to exhibit those fruits of the Spirit. You have to have the love of the heart and then do that.
I think Wendell was saying the source is God, and we understand that. Without him and our response to him, none of this would be possible.
And it's not God's choosing, it's our choosing.
Right. We've got to be receptive to it and willing to exhibit them. Right. Right. You know, in the Sermon on the Mount, at the beginning of it in Matthew 5, Jesus does a lot of describing personal attributes that we need to have as citizens of his kingdom. Talking about poor in spirit and hungering for righteousness and all of this sort of thing. And this goes maybe a little bit further to identify personal traits and characteristics that we need to be able to exhibit, that we take upon ourselves. It also makes me think of what Peter wrote in adding to faith, virtue, knowledge, temperance, and all that list. So these are things that we, as Christians, try to add to our lives and exhibit these personality traits in our life. And I think about these, and it makes me think about the people that I like to be with. and the people that I would like to be like, and it's people that exhibit these things right here. And they're people that show that they're loving, they have concern. Yes, sir, Chris.
These grown that may be very pleasant to them. It's not as hard for them to grow these. But somebody who may have a nasty demeanor, it takes more transition and more conforming
Right.
to do these things. You mean no
Right.
nasty tendencies, not these.
Right.
Like, I mean, that's not
Right. What's that now? No.
they're
Right. Right. Right.
Had their son that don't have a demeanor at all.
That may be. Oh my. And Chris is accurate there. Everyone is born with a particular type of personality, but I think when we see someone, we don't want to automatically think that whatever they're exhibiting it was something that they just automatically had. It may be the result of experiences that they've gone through and actually control that they've had over some of those negative traits that other people exhibit, and a lot of it has to do with what you choose.
naturally pleasant demeanored people grow sour. I mean, you know, this is part of the cycle of life. Is we get burned, we get scorned, we get
Right.
mistreated, whatever. So you can see that in people.
The potential is always there to go either direction. It's how much we take into our lives God's direction and His Word, and the encouragement that we get through Jesus Christ as to how we respond and how then we relate to others.
People's demeanor, or whatever you want to call me, is not something that's gonna, when we are baptized and we arise to walk in newness of life, the old man of sin's put off. But if we believe that it's just like flipping a light switch, and then these things, these bad things in my life is going to go away automatically, and they'll never bother me again.
No.
And anybody, I don't care when, can improve himself.
That's exactly right.
Been with temper, had temper when
I did too.
and I said, be that way. And it's took me a long time to get it under control. And sometimes now I don't control it.
I had a real bad temper. I remember my dad, I was probably around 13 or 14, and he set me down because I would let loose and be hateful and this sort of thing, and I was making my mom cry ever so often. He set me down. He said, "You better get control of that." He said, "You're going to find somebody that's got a worse temper than you do." But he said, "This is not the way you ought to be." And I had to work at it, Jimmy. I'm exactly like you. It was not something that just automatically came.
Time. People didn't have before. And things didn't suit some of them as well as it should have, I guess. And they were ill tempered,
Right.
and they I grew up in that. And so in turn I had to be what I say defensive to standing. I mean, I had to toughen up.
Yeah.
But then that was the wrong direction.
Yeah.
So I had to do some changing.
All right.
when me and Bonnie married, I mean, I said, I'm not gonna be that.
Right. As we're going through here, the next item or next characteristic is one of joy. What do you?
Loved it, buddy. I'm sorry.
Oh, I didn't hear what Bonnie said, so I didn't enjoy that. But that's okay. The next characteristic is one of joy. All of these are love that he's talking about here, and we've talked about this, is agape love. That's the word that's used here. And that is the love that is a matter of will. It's not an emotion that just comes because of a feeling that you have, but it's something that you determine that you're going to have, and you will that you're going to have this love for all other people. And joy is the same way. Uh, Sometimes we get the impression, and a lot of times, uh, children grow up thinking, "Well, I'll be happy or I'll be joyous if it's all based on something external." This is not an external joy. This is something from within, and it's based on this relationship with God. It's not a matter of what you get or what you have. It's a determination. I'm going to be joyful in life. He doesn't mention this here, but I'd like to connect this with something that Paul talked about in the book of Timothy. He had learned in whatever state he was in to be content. I think that characteristic is what has to be there for these to develop. Like Jimmy was saying, you grow up in difficult times. Well, you've got a choice to make. Am I going to be content, or am I going to be resentful and begrudge other people having what I perceive that I don't have? And in that case, we can get bitter or we can get better. And it's God wants us to be better. And so here again, this is a fruit that we have the option, the choice of developing. It's not something that's going to happen to us. We make it happen. And I like to think about that. And then peace, being peaceful in nature. In other words, this is a person that seeks to be at peace with others, not looking for something to be offended about. And there are people who go through life, and it's as though they're looking for things to make them unhappy. They're looking for offenses from others. Uh, and there are people that are just argumentative sometimes. That was something else I had to overcome. My mom told me one day that I'd argue with a post that I set up myself. And so those are characteristics that we can carry around, and we don't. It's something we have to work at, and this is something, again, you determine. I'm not going to be that type of person that is going to be nitpicking, that's always looking for an offense, or looking about a way that I can be argumentative and contrary to other people. Yes, sir.
The person that just wanted to argue with he didn't know near as much as he thought he did.
Well, that's true. That's true.
That's one of
Go ahead.
that's one of the attributes that was talked about in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers.
Right. That's exactly right.
Sometimes that's hard.
Well, and Paul has what, Romans 12, as far as it's possible, live at peace with all men. It's in one of his books. I think it's Romans 12th chapter, but I may be wrong there. But yeah, uh, it is something that we have to work at. And also, the peace that is here is a realization of a peace that we have with God. It's the blessing of being able to recognize our justification, that our sins have been forgiven, and because of that, we have this relationship with God. He's our Father. We're a part of His family. We're joint heirs with Christ, and that's the peace that passes all understanding that we have referred to. Chris, you were going to say something.
Do you think that the reason that right had to do with the
I don't know. I'm not for sure the origin of it, other than, they could have said a stump. I think it was something that was hard headed and had no real response to make.
You'd argue with a signboard.
Yeah, and I've heard that too. I've heard that too. Okay, we're confessing our faults this morning, and those were those were certainly some that I had,
I think
and I hope I've overcome them.
I think the thing about those sayings was basically you were arguing with something that had no capability of arguing back. You
Yeah.
just stood there.
Yeah, and it was a fact you just like to argue,
Yeah.
to hear yourself argue. Yeah. He goes on and uses the term long suffering. This has to do with our relationship with others. Again, are we going to be someone who is kind hearted and meek toward others? Are we going to go out of the way to be kind to them? Are we going to overlook their offenses at us and not respond in a hateful sort of way? So these are some wonderful characteristics and traits. Like I said, these are people that you want to be around. These are the people that you appreciate. And then kindness, going out of your way to be kind and loving to someone else, taking advantage of opportunities to do good to them, uh, being gentle with them. Uh, he's going to talk about gentleness in a little bit later. And then goodness. These are people that just simply love good. They're people that don't enjoy stuff that's evil, nasty, dirty, uh, being around sin. They are just basically good. And this is a trait that you have to develop because, again, the possibility is there and the lure is there, and Satan's always going to be there trying to pull you in that direction. You know, sin has its lure, and he's going to make it look enjoyable and fun and something that you want, and and we have to be very aware of what he's trying to do with us. And then faithfulness. This is a person who is honest and true, has integrity. He's going to whatever he says, that's what he's going to do. And also, it means someone that you can depend on because they're faithful. They're going to do whatever they've said they'll do. And then you have the gentleness there. This is someone that's not harsh, abrasive, uh, prickly like a cactus. Uh, and then you have someone that's under self-control. Temperate is another word that's sometimes used for this word self-control. And so this is someone who controls their tongue. And James talks about the difficulty that you have there. And I'll confess again, I've had problems with, when you've got a temper, it's easy to let go and say things you're not supposed to say.
But a soft
And that can be a curse word. It can be some harsh statement that you make to someone, without thinking. And so this is a person that has worked to control these negative emotions that are there. That's but like I said, the potential is always there.
this comment here that I'm reading along in a commentary. It says the world knows something of self-control, but almost always for a selfish reason. It knows the self-discipline and denial someone will go through for themselves. This is in contrast to that. It's not a self-control for yourself to like we discipline ourselves not to eat a certain diet or we
Right.
discipline ourselves to go to the
Right.
gym or whatever. That's not the kind of self-control that's here. It's in opposition.
This has to do with your relationship with others, right? You're putting them before yourself. and thinking of their good, not yours. I like that. Yes, sir, Steve. You were going to say something.
One of the references in that that I have here talking about the fruit of the Spirit is Matthew chapter 7, verse 16. It says, "You will know them by their fruits."
Right.
People see us, people watch us.
Right.
If we don't exhibit these things, we will never be able to
That's
reach
exactly
anyone.
right.
If we
That's
don't
why it's extremely important when you claim to be a Christian, you need to be exhibiting these, because otherwise the big word H, hypocrite, comes into the person's mind, And so, yes, we have to be very, very conscious of that. He goes on to say that against such, there is no law. Now, he's just gone through this long list of the works of the flesh. There was a law against all of those, weren't there?
Any sinful item, there's a law against it.
Right. There's a law against it. Now, the law was given to point out sin and to say, you will not do this. God does not want you to do this. This is not living for Him. On the other flip point is there's no law against this. There's no maximum amount that you're going to do in developing these characteristics. In other words, there's never going to be a point that you ever stop and say, well, I've loved enough. I don't have to do it anymore. No.
There's no restriction.
No restrictions. Yeah, you go as far as you can. And these are developed in us. And they're things we grow in. And like I think Jimmy said, there's always room for improvement in all of these. And these are areas that we're going to slip and fall on sometimes too. No matter how hard we try, there are going to be times when we may let our temper get away with us. And we may say things that we shouldn't say, and we may not be as loving as we ought to be. And so these are things that we come back to, and of course we have to repent and do better and to try to grow even more. Because who's the prime example that we have in all of these areas? It's Jesus Christ. He's our goal. He's our example. And although we'll never reach it, we need to be striving to be as much like Him in these areas as we possibly can be.
If we think
Well, I every one of these, he
Exhibited.
yeah, but he extended it to individuals. I mean, think about all the times that Jesus was cornered or trapped. Think of all the times that he could have reacted, and yet these are the things he displayed.
Right. Another thing that we need to realize that each one of us are individuals, and we're going to be somewhere on a spectrum of developing these, and we're not all going to be at the same point. And so that means that we're going to have to be using these in getting along with one another. And we don't set ourselves up as the standard. And we don't compare ourselves with other people. We don't say, well, I'm better than he is because, this, and this. We don't do that. Can't do that. And so that's one of the ways that we need to look at this. Paul in Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 17 had this to say. He says, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in song and hymns and spiritual song, singing with grace in your heart to the Lord. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, or by the authority of Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Christ. So that's just a parallel passage that expands a little bit, includes a little bit more, but Paul, being the same author, is basically helping to give us commentary on what he said here to the Galatian brethren. He said, and those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. The only way these are going to be able to be put into our lives and and allowed to grow as they should is if we go through this process of putting to death that old man of sin that he's just talked about. And of course, that should make us think about Romans, the 6th chapter, verse 6, where he talks about putting to death or crucifying that old man of sin, burying him in that watery grave of baptism with Christ, and then rising up to walk a new life. And so that's what he's talking about here. We put to death that old man of sin with the passions and desires that are there. That no longer is our ruling priority in life. That's what it's talking about in John 1, 1 John 1 and 7, about walking in the light. It's the person who has put to death that old man of sin. He's determined that he's going to be developing these traits. And in that process, he is trying to become like Christ, and he's having fellowship with Christ. And in that way, then he's doing what is being encouraged here. So he's living by the Spirit. And in that process, then Christ's blood continually cleanses the person from sin. They're not going to be perfect. God recognizes that. We all sin. And John says if you say you haven't sinned, then you're either a liar or you make God a liar, because it's not possible for us to be sinless. If it were possible for us to be sinless, then Christ would not have had to die, would he? And so that's a recognition of that here. He says, if we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Now, he had a lot to say about walking in the Spirit over in Romans, the 8th chapter. If you'll recall what we studied when we were going through the book of Romans, there, particularly in verse 5, starting there with verse 5 and going on then through verse 11. He says, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can be. So then those who are in the flesh cannot please God. But you're not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. Now, if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he is not his. And if Christ is in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit is life because of righteousness. But if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. So what a great promise there is to those of us who are trying to live in the Spirit and directed by the Spirit, putting to death the old man of sin, saying, no, that's not the life I want to live, because of the promise of life eternal. That's what Paul said there in Romans, the 8th chapter. Then he goes on in verse 26, he says, let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. Have you wondered why he would follow up this section with that kind of admonition about don't become conceited, don't start thinking more of yourself than you ought to think? What's that? It's what the Jews did, but is not the potential also for someone that is striving to be like Jesus, and if they achieve, let's say their beginning, sometimes you start getting proud of yourself?
If you come out of a real sinful life and you obey the gospel and you're really desiring to change, and it's becoming evident to people you're changing, it'll be evident to you that you're changing. And if you're not real careful, you'll get to thinking, look what I've done. I have made such a monumental change
Yes.
It should be recognized. It
Yeah.
should be bragged upon even.
I was going to say, yeah, people are bragging. Uh-huh.
And just, it's real easy to take yourself from real low to too.
And then we can become like Chris talking about the Jews who were so proud they looked down on everybody else. I'm so much better than you are. And so that's why he felt like it was necessary here to make that kind of an admonition. Don't allow this seeking a new life to fill you with a pride based on you, because what you've got to keep in mind is the example, the standard is Christ, and you're never going to measure up to the standard.
Really good from something like
Right. Exactly right, Joey.
humbleness that you should have. And I've always thought the greatest trait of a true Christian can have is humility.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Well, he goes on and he says, don't envy one another. And this can be a source of envy, can it? As we're trying to develop these, we see someone else that we think, man, I wish I could be like them, and they're doing so much, and they just show this, and we can then have that negative feeling and become envious, jealous. And he's saying, don't do that.
He says that and so many other men were killed because of envy.
Yeah.
He used that, and there's a whole section in one of his writings on how envious people became
Yeah.
of Christianity.
Well, look at the Corinthians that we just went through. They had developed jealousy over spiritual gifts, thinking that one was better than the other. Yeah, right. And so yeah, this Paul is very, very down to earth, isn't he? And he knows human nature, and that's the reason he comes through with these. Of course, the Spirit's directing him, and certainly God knows us, and knows the potential. And so these admonitions are there. He starts out then the 6th chapter. He says, "Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted." So now he's going to turn to this situation that within the brotherhood, there's someone within the congregation who becomes involved in some sort of sin. The first reaction that people can have might be shock. Beyond that, it might be negative to the point of distaste, depending on what the sin is. And it's not listed. He says any sin. But if we think about sin that's prominent in the world today, it could be uh, fornication, it could be adultery, it could be pornography, it could be drug use, it could be alcohol, it could be stealing, Christians caught in the act of shoplifting and this sort of thing. Uh, he's talking about an attitude that we ought to have toward this individual. One is that we don't judge him as not being worthy of God's love. In fact, our intent is to bring him back so that he can be forgiven of that sin. And we can't do that if we have this attitude of you're filthy, you're untouchable, you're down here, and I'm up here, and I'm looking down on you, and I'm going to pull you back up. Because what he's saying is you need to have the attitude, but for the grace of God, that could be me. Right, right,
Don't
right.
and not even just talking about church that we know that we have details of. I'm talking about Christianity as a whole is known for being goody two shoes or holier than thou and that kind of mentality, even as it has morphed into what it is now. Who knows how to describe it, but even still,
I would say this though, Chris, even though the Christian may not be putting forth that persona, that is going to be the thought of those who are living opposed to what they're endorsing. In other words, just simply living for Christ and saying, this is the life I'm going to live, to those people, it's judgmental. And they're going to accuse them of being, holier than thou and this sort of thing. So,
Yeah, there's this projection
right.
to undermine any of you.
Right.
They're
Right.
not.
Well, the Jews are a perfect example that Christ had to deal with of what you're talking about. Uh, and I'm sure that there were cases, maybe even in the congregations, where that would have been true. In fact, uh, with the Corinthians, Paul had to encourage them to accept that brother that had sinned back, because they were acting like, no, you've done the unpardonable. We don't want you. We don't want you a part of us anymore. And he'd repented. And Paul says, yeah, right,
Separation, kind of like the Pharisees' name.
right, right, right. And historically, if you study the Puritans, they became very judgmental and critical, and so yeah, we certainly don't want that, and that's what he's saying here. You restore that person with a spirit of gentleness and love, uh, and keeping in mind that you might be in that situation sometime. You may be led away into sin. That the potential is there. He goes on, he says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Here again, this is talking about the relationship that we need to have. And burdens, here can mean a whole wide range of things. It can be a matter of helping financially, but it can be helping someone emotionally. It can be helping in so many different ways. However, we uh, are burdened. We can be burdened with grief. We can be burdened with worry, depression. And we, as God's people, need to try to be as sensitive as we can to others, and what they're going through. And then when we find out that someone's going through some difficult times, then extend ourselves with whatever we have within our capacity to help them to bear that burden. And sometimes it's just a matter of going to them and say, I've been praying for you and I'm here for you. I want you to know. And if you need to talk with someone, I'm available. Anytime. Uh, it might be taking some food to someone that you know's been sick and not able to, to prepare the food. There's so many things that this would involve, but that's the kind of people he wants us to be, that we are willing to put ourselves out to help someone else, to bear their burdens. And that's going to be reciprocal, isn't it? I mean, you don't do it with that intent, but if you're that kind of person, guess what? When you're in trouble, they're going to remember and they're going to be there for you as well. He says, for if anyone thinks of himself to be something when he's nothing, he deceives himself. If we get to thinking that we're something real important, sometimes we think we're irreplaceable. Guess what?
You can run up on that quite often in life.
Yes, we do.
Human being.
That's true. We've all come across people like that, and we may have fallen into that category. We may have at points thought more of ourselves than we should have thought, and then, as my parents would say, you got taken down a peg, haven't you?
That's another example of our thoughts sometimes can get us into trouble. What we think can get us into
Right.
trouble.
You know what? Over in Romans, the 12th chapter, you have Paul saying, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think soberly. In other words, be honest and objective in your thoughts about yourself, and make sure that when you're making these evaluations, keep in mind that Christ is the example, not someone else. You don't build yourself up by comparison with someone else. What you do is to try to live according to Christ, and realize at that point that try as hard as we may, we're not ever going to reach the standard. And so there's no reason, does not give us any room to brag, does it? Yes, sir, Barry.
When you approach someone that you feel has been doing wrong, I think you ought to put a piece of tape around your four fingers right here. That way when you reach out, you're not pointing, you're offering a handshake. You'll go a lot further grabbing his hand, shaking it, talking to him about it, and pointing the finger. You're not gonna get anywhere.
Yeah.
He tells us to be understanding people. And it didn't, I don't think that means just in good. It also means in bad sometimes. We understand. We don't condone it, but we understand.
Right. Right. We look at anyone with the point of view that, I'm not sinless. I may not be guilty of the exact same sin you're guilty of, but I'm certainly guilty of sin.
Sure.
That's exactly right.
It gives the think about yourself soberly.
Uh-huh.
Immediate thing I think, when you see someone who is on alcohol, for an example, they have another impression of themselves on that than off it, right? But that doesn't just talk about maybe being inebriated. You could be drunk on power. You could be drunk on all kinds of things that get in your head and keep you from thinking correctly.
Right.
And I heard somebody say one time at a funeral that this person had committed suicide. And the justification, or the kind of trying to ease it and make it not sound so bad, was, well, they were not in their right mind. And I know that there are some people who medication can alter their minds, bad thoughts can alter their minds. But in reality, I understood what was being said. It's a bad situation, and anybody that goes to that point obviously isn't thinking sober. They're not thinking straight. Or I can't make even that statement, because they may be thinking straight and they're just in so much pain that that's justifiable to them. So I should have said that. But none of us who are intentionally sinning are in our right mind. Because if we were, we'd be thinking soberly.
Right.
So I can see that mentality, but I think that mentality can go a long way
Right.
to where when we choose to sin, we're not in our right mind.
Right.
We're selfish, or we're whatever.
Right.
So that mind, man, I'm telling you, that mind and how we think, it's a dangerous thing, but it can also be the only thing that brings you out of it.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah, we can have a distorted perception of ourselves very easily from all sorts of sources, like you're saying, and he's cautioning us here to think soberly. In other words, objectively, and see yourself as others see you. That's, I think, is important.